Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to continue our conversation about core and competition. We've already talked a little bit about the core sources of advantage and how customers perceive you. We now want to talk a little bit about how startups compete differently than established businesses. Very briefly, we want to emphasize the traditional perspective on competitive strategy. Professor Porter recognized that competitive strategy is based on either being cost-oriented or differentiated, and that the scope of competition can be either broad or focused. This leads to a simple categorization of different competitive strategies, in which there are potentially 4 different types of strategies: broad or industry-wide low cost, broad differentiated, or focused cost competition, or focused differentiation. The challenge is that many entrepreneurs start ventures thinking that it's great to be both, that they can be both low cost and differentiated. But more often than not, when any company or startup companies try to be both low cost and differentiated, they're vulnerable to firms that are effectively executing one of the strategies more effectively. It's really important not to confuse short-term advantage with long-term sustainable advantage. Sure, you could launch into an industry with extremely low prices, which might get you some market share, but that's not a sustainable long-term competitive strategy. If you're trying to do lots of different things, you probably can't do them as well as one company that's only doing one thing. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a separate audio presentation focused on competitive strategy, but it's really important that you have this basic understanding here. The bottom line is that startup competition tends to be different. You usually can't look to competition for all of the solutions. Simply copying everything that your competitors are doing is also unlikely to be successful. Sure, it's good, it can be very powerful to be a fast follower, but that doesn't mean that you can simply do everything that your competitors are doing. Entrepreneurs win by having some key differences. Another factor is to choose not to respond instantly as competition or the industry shifts. It's important to be agile. That is, if significant changes are happening, especially associated with customer needs, you need to respond to those. But you also need to remember what your long-term vision is, and making many changes quickly is likely simply to reduce your focus and cause you to invest in efforts that don't actually ever get completed. This emphasis on focus is really worth mentioning here. As a startup, you should be focused on competing in one event. So here's just some information from the 2016 Summer Olympics in Rio showing the times for the 100-meter dash and the long jump, times for the 100-meter dash and distances for the long jump, comparing the winners of the decathlon versus the individual events. And you should immediately see that the individuals who focused on one single thing, people like Usain Bolt in the 100-meter dash or Giannon Henderson in the long jump, consistently outperformed the people who were in the decathlon. The point here is to focus on one thing and to do it really well. Over time, as you expand your business, you may be able to compete across segments and markets, but it's really hard to be good at lots and lots of things. So take the lesson of the Olympics, focus on one event, and do that really well, because you'll notice, for example, that none of the top 300-meter dash winners are successful in the long jump. I'm guessing they don't even compete in there, and there's a reason for that. Focus on doing one thing incredibly well. As you think about competition, try to keep a couple things in mind. First, be really careful about assumption. As I've mentioned elsewhere, I've almost never seen situations in which new ventures don't have competition at all. It's one of the red flags is when an entrepreneur says, I have no competition. Remember that there are advantages to being a small firm. You can deploy resources more quickly, you can make decisions more quickly, you can adapt more quickly. Look for ways of addressing switching costs from your customers and then keeping them locked in with what you're providing once you've got them as a customer. You should assume, broadly speaking, that you have no advantages when compared to existing companies. That's kind of the baseline assumption, is that when you enter an industry, you have no real advantages over your competitors. And that's because they have experience, they have the relationships with the customers, they have brand value, they have operations, they have suppliers, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean you should despair. This assumption isn't 100% correct, but it should be your starting point for thinking about how you're going to compete. What are some of those big advantages? Well, you can have high-powered incentives for your employees, big bonuses, stock options. You can have key flexibility on incentives for absolutely essential employees. You have an idea, you have the passion and the power behind something that you're trying to do that's new. Small firms can move much more quickly than large firms. The odds are good that you can find ways to fit with your environment. And if the environment, that is the industrial environment that you're operating in, whether it's the market conditions or your partnerships or customers or suppliers, it's way easier to change a small firm to fit with those elements of the environment than it is to change a really, really large firm. You have no legacy costs. That is, you don't have all this history and all this operations. You probably don't have huge facilities you're trying to pay off. When big organizations are trying to change, they have to take all of those things into account, and you don't. And arguably, you may have more people at your organization closer to customers. At a big corporation, a relatively small number of people interact with customers on a day-to-day basis. But at your firm, you may have almost everyone engaged with customers, which means you can be much more sophisticated and smart about what customers are actually asking for right now. A great example of this is in the disk drive industry, and this is the basis for a really famous book, which I strongly, strongly encourage you to read, called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And Christensen studied the disk drive industry, which we don't even really think about anymore because this is 30, 40 years ago. But there were all of these companies that were disk drive companies, and over time, advances in technology were changing the structure and function of disk drives. And you would think that the companies that were already entrenched in the industry, the ones that were making disk drives and had customers, would be the ones that would be successful bringing new disk drives to market. And in fact, that was completely not the case. And you can see it on this chart. Every time there was a change in the standard size of disk drives, new ventures were the ones who led the charge and were ultimately successful. And the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, walks through why that was, why it was that the big companies who had all the resources and all the customer relationships couldn't successfully adapt to bring the new products to market. So this is a really important lesson to remember and think about in terms of how small firms can be so successful in an evolving industry situation. Another key thing is to recognize when there are switching costs. Classic example of this, Windows and Mac. So once you've gotten used to using a Windows machine, it's quite challenging to switch to a Mac. There's so many different hotkeys and other functions that are just different. There's both the cognitive user level, that is how the individual thinks about the product. There could be complementary assets that are at issue here. So for example, if you're running a laptop and you're using Windows, you may be running everything on Google, and so it's really easy to use your Android phone. If you buy a Mac, it may feel like it's not as simple to make that switch. Alternately, if you have a Mac and you also have an iPhone, you may not be as excited about switching to a Windows machine. There are higher search costs for making those kinds of switches. And of course, in some cases, there are specific network effects as well, where you're using a product that other people that you interact with are using the same kind of product. The different costs that can be associated, time, money, knowledge, and then of course just opportunity cost. What are you giving up to try the new thing? All of these can lead to lock-in, where individuals and companies tend to use the same products over and over and over again. And you need to be aware of that, because just bringing a better product to market doesn't mean you're going to be able to get people to switch from the one that they are already using. And if you remember from the innovation marketplace activity that we probably did, you may remember how that everybody uses a QWERTY keyboard, even though there's probably a better alternative in the Dvorak. And this is exactly the reason why. Overcoming those switching costs can be a challenge. You're going to have to provide a solution that either removes or at least reduces those switching costs. It's probably going to be need to be technologically better than whatever the incumbent is offering, where the benefit outweighs not just the costs, that is, not just the raw costs, the financial costs, but also the perception of risk and uncertainty. If your customer thinks that there are things that could go wrong, they're probably going to exaggerate those actual risks, and they may not choose to use your product simply because they perceive there's more problems than there really are. Finally, it has to fit the customer purchase logic. That is, you have to be able to get your product inserted into the process by which customers actually make purchases. If they're making all of these purchases through a distributor, it's going to be quite challenging for you if you're only offering your products online, because you're simply not going to turn up on their radar screen. So you have to think through not just why they purchase, but how they purchase. Once you have them as a customer, of course, the opposite is true. You want to establish switching costs to prevent them from signing up with competitors. You might have contractual provisions, especially with business customers, where they get extended warranties or exclusive access to specific products or changes or updates. You try very hard to help them stagger purchases. This is often the case with things like durable purchases, such as equipment or even kitchen appliances. Wherever possible, you want to have unique interfaces such that they've gotten trained on specifically how your brand products work. And that makes it harder for them to switch to something else because their learning is all bound up in this. You might acquire or otherwise neutralize other suppliers. You can help create customized solutions. This increases their search costs for solutions that do the same thing from other providers. So if you're providing a solution to your customer that meets their needs so well that it becomes costly for them to try to find another supplier who can produce exactly the same thing. And then, of course, there are always loyalty programs, things like frequent flyer programs and rewards, coffee punch cards, and so on and so forth. All of those kinds of things increase the switching cost for your customers. Here's the bottom line. We've talked about this repeatedly. Success in bringing a new product or service to market is about much more than having a superior innovation. That can be a starting point, but it's almost never enough. Real success is about execution, creating value for customers that they perceive. Remember, this isn't about what you think, it's about what your customers think. And if they believe there's demonstrated value compared to competition, then they are likely to purchase your product. So I hope that this has given you some thoughts about strategy, as well as understanding the key aspects of switching costs behind why customers do or don't change products or services that they're already purchasing.